know we talked about Hello, viewers. My name is Nicole Howard, and I'm here to introduce Cafe Chat. Now, what is Cafe Chat? Cafe Chat is a group of 8 women from around the world, ranging from Nigeria, Canada, US, Chile, Spain, and we are dedicated to helping improve critical thinking in young women's lives. Today, for our podcast named Cafe Chat, we have our episode is titled Critical Thinking in Law. Today I have Denise with me, and she is a lawyer from Houston, Texas, focusing on advocating for criminal rights cases. Hello, Denise. How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for willing to be our first participant in our first ever Cafe Chat podcast episode. So now I'm going to start out to the meat and potatoes of this episode and start out with the first question. So what is critical thinking? How would you define it?
I would define critical thinking as looking at the facts as they really are to form a judgment. It is rational, it is questioning, it is skeptical, and it's unbiased. It requires self-direction, self-discipline, and the ability to self-correct. Engaging in critical thinking requires a person to be an effective problem solver and a good communicator.
So how does critical thinking relate to your career, and how have you applied it in your day-to-day career life?
In law school, attorneys are taught to look at both sides of an issue. To be a good and effective attorney, you need to be able to understand and argue both points of view. So if you look at it that way, someone who's a critical thinker should be able to develop and refine this skill as well, because you need to be able to look at issues and arguments from multiple points of view so that you can understand them, ask questions about them, and apply them.
So next question, how can we exercise our freedom through critical thinking?
Critical thinking allows us to discern what is true and good through rigorously analyzing and questioning facts, motivations, and possible outcomes of a course of action, along with other things. Only by doing this can we possibly exercise our God-given freedom in a responsible way. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but freedom is not licensed to do whatever we want. Mm-hmm. It is the power and right to do what is both right and moral. Critical thinking also helps us to be leaders in our circles of influence. Critical thinkers don't tend to be followers or easily swayed by others. They are not likely to relinquish their freedom or relinquish power to those who don't deserve it. Ultimately, critical thinking serves the ends of liberty and the dignity of every person.
Thank you so much for your answer. That was very beautifully worded. So now I have a follow-up question to your answer. How would you specifically define freedom? If you had one sentence to define freedom, what would you give? What answer would you give?
I'm actually going to give maybe a bit longer
no
answer
problem.
than anticipated.
No problem.
The Catechism of the Catholic Church reveals that man's freedom is rooted in his or her being made in the image and likeness of God. God created man a rational being, conferring upon him the dignity of a person who can initiate and control his own actions. The more one does what is good, the freer she becomes. There is no true freedom except in the service of what is good and just. St. Paul wrote in Galatians, "For freedom, Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery, for you were called for freedom. But do not use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Rather, serve one another through love." As I mentioned earlier, true freedom is the power and right to do that which is right and good. is an essential requirement of human dignity. We become increasingly free to the extent that we turn away from sin and choose instead to direct our lives and actions toward God in service to one another, doing what we ought rather than what we want. Now, it's the duty of our government and our civil authorities to protect the rights of all who choose to do that which is good. However, those protections do not mean granting people license to do whatever they choose.
Right.
The Catechism of the Catholic Church reminds us that the exercise of freedom does not imply a right to say or do everything. But seemingly many in our culture embrace a concept of freedom that lacks reference to objective moral truth and instead elevate personal autonomy as the greatest good. While few people would advocate for a society with no boundaries or no rules, the movement away from recognizing an objective and knowable truth has kind of set in motion a cultural acceptance of a freedom that allows one to do simply what one chooses rather than what is good. The concept of freedom should be limited to the extent that what one does should not harm another. So this concept that we're only limited in that whatever we choose to do shouldn't be harmful to someone else is of limited value in such a culture where truth has been deemed relative.
Right.
Freedom becomes defined by the boundaries imposed by those exercising power and does not necessarily reflect a reasoned understanding of what is good. It simply reflects what the majority or a powerful minority value. So currently, under the umbrella of freedom, as our society's defining it, the law in America, where I live, and in other nations allows abortion to persons of the same sex to marry, doctors to assist others to commit suicide. So we kind of have to wonder what legal rights might next be secured in the name of freedom, as society now understands it.
So then society's perspective of freedom is to abide by rules and be allowed to do what they want to do, what they deem freedom. So it's individually an individualistic view of freedom is what society's perfection of freedom is.
It is, and we each determine for ourselves what is good and what we should be doing instead of looking at some sort of objective moral truth. And that's simply a recipe for chaos. And a lot of the destruction that we see within our society today.
From your time being a lawyer, how do you see freedom in the law, and how does the law structure freedom? For instance, if you have some cases where a lawyer has protected their clients at all costs, even though their client did something wrong, that's considered just in the name of the law because it's a lawyer's duty to protect their clients' rights and make sure they undergo due process. So how does freedom tie into that? And how does good and bad tie into that from the lawyer's perspective?
Well, you have to remember in a lot of situations like that, you have competing goods. There's not just one good objective. There may be multiple objectives. So as an attorney, you have to weigh those. As an attorney, you have an ethical obligation to represent the best interest of your client. But that does not go so far as to, for example, allow your client to commit a crime or allow them to go on the stand in court and lie.
Right.
All of those things you cannot do. So you have to understand the boundaries within which you're operating and the competing goods. And a lot of times it's a struggle. And that's why we need to know a moral and objective truth and a higher goal so that all these competing goods don't put us in a position where we do something that's harmful.
Okay. So freedom really is boundaries that are set by good and bad, is what it really is. But society believes that freedom is something that you take upon to understand yourself. Whereas what it really is, and what you've seen in your profession and your career, is that it is bounded by good and bad.
Yes. And too many people have come to view it as freedom is no boundaries. And what we all see the problems in society from having that viewpoint.
Yes.
No boundaries, and what I deem to be good and true is all that's necessary, instead of referring to some sort of objective truth.
Okay. So then, do you consider lack of critical thinking and questioning, does that tend to cause a lack of freedom, or is it the opposite?
I think if we fail to think critically, to question, to be skeptical, we're not really free.
Mm,
As we've said a couple of times, freedom comes from pursuing what is good and true.
okay.
And we can only discern what is good and true by asking questions and pondering the answers to our questions and actively seeking out the truth. So if you're not thinking and you're not questioning, then I would posit that you lack freedom.
Okay. So they are directly correlated to each other.
They are.
Okay. So how can critical thinking help us to grow in our relationship with others? As well as a caveat to that, how, when you have your client attorney relationship, how does critical thinking help build that relationship between you and your client when you are defending them?
Well, to answer the first question, critical thinking helps us to learn about ourselves, what motivates us, what animates us, and what we truly value. If you think critically, you also tend to be open to others and their viewpoints. It's much easier to will the good of others when you rationally look at them and the world around us as we truly are. And you can only discern what our circumstances truly are by thinking and questioning and pursuing the good and the beautiful. And only then can we discern what's true.
Okay.
In terms of dealing with my clients and my relationships with my clients, I have to be willing to look critically at the information that they provide me and the circumstances that they're in and the possible outcomes and what they tell me they want out of their case, so that I can challenge some of maybe their facts or their presuppositions or their biases, so that perhaps maybe we can actually get to what is truly good. I've done a lot of criminal work. And over that time, I've had to work with a lot of defendants who understandably were afraid of the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
But there were times when I was able to work with them and counsel them and show them that paying the proper consequence for what they had done could actually be beneficial to them in the long run. Not always easy to tell people because, we're always afraid to suffer bad consequences. But just as, God sometimes allows us to suffer the bad consequences of our choices, we have to sometimes allow that for those around us as well.
So kind of a follow-up question to the previous question I posed. So in regard to when you're defining people, what are the best methods to bring people to that point where you can understand their critical thinking pathways or understand where they're coming from and understand those biases? What are some good questions that you tend to ask people, or some conversations you've had with your clients that really help brings out that relationship?
The foundation of doing that is really listening. It's not so much me talking, it's me really listening to what they're saying and what they're not saying.
Okay.
And then following up and showing them that I am genuinely interested in what they're good and what is good for them. And making them understand that sometimes what is ultimately good may not be their current perception of it.
Okay.
That there are always a multitude of outcomes that may come about from a particular case.
Okay.
And we often, decide ahead of time, this is the one good outcome. This is the one that I want. And then that may not be the right one.
Yeah.
And as the process unfolds, sometimes you're able to demonstrate that to them by talking to them and really listening to them and really caring about the person in front of you. You may not like everything about them. Certainly many of the criminal defendants that I represented, there were a lot of things about them I did not like, but they are still a human being made in the image of God. And there is good there. And there is an opportunity for them to pursue good and to change the path they're on. And it's an honor for me as an attorney to play a small role in that.
Okay. So then my final question that I would love to discuss with you about is how can we as listeners and our viewers, and especially us women of Cafe Chat, how can we apply this information that we've just talked about, the links of foundation and critical thinking, and also your experience as a lawyer? How can we apply that to our own lives and in our own ways?
I would encourage everyone listening to really embrace the freedom that comes from pursuing the good and the beautiful and ordering our lives accordingly. Because our society desperately needs people who understand true freedom, who think deeply and are willing to work and even face negative consequences that come from going against society's distorted view of freedom. That can be really intimidating, but it's something we need to embrace for the good of ourselves, for the good of our families, for the good of those around us. Because too many in our society seem willing to give up on true freedom for the sake of safety, convenience, or a false ease of life. And we need to fight against this, or we will lose our freedom and dignity as children of God. And as an attorney, I'm able to work directly now. I've done criminal work in the past. Now I do constitutional work in the United States. So I work on First Amendment freedoms and the right to life, which too often cuts against current American law.
Right.
But there's an ultimate better goal that I'm willing to sacrifice and work for. And I think all of us have those opportunities in our lives, within our families, within our friend groups, and within our jobs to pursue what is good and right and beautiful. And you'd be surprised at who's watching and who's learning from your experience, even people you're completely unaware of.
So kind of a follow-up question, what's kind of some of your best memories that you've had being able to share that kind of experience you've had throughout your career as a lawyer, where you've really seen someone develop that critical thinking? And where do you think that that is something that's very important to remember and an example for us to kind of think about and ponder about when we're listening to this podcast?
As somebody who's been practicing law for a while now, I've had the opportunity to work with young law students. So people in law school on their way to becoming attorneys. And in doing pro-life work, I've had a lot of very dedicated and enthusiastic law student interns for the summer that would work with me on a variety of projects. But one thing I would notice a lot of them as they dug into the law related to abortion, for example, they would get very dejected. They would have a really hard time understanding how this could happen, how our law could embrace something such as this, how people could think that this is actually a moral good. So you would see these students come in and start with me being really excited and they wanted to change the world. And as they worked more in this area, it hurt their heart. It dejected them to realize the lies that have been told to women and to society that this is a good. And in a sense that, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to do anything about this. This is so ingrained, nothing's going to change. And so I would have the opportunity to sit down with them and talk with them and tell them what I love, what Mother Teresa said, is that God doesn't call us to be successful, he calls us to be faithful. And I reminded them that God was calling them to be faithful in this calling and to look at issues and think about issues and ask questions, and that they themselves might be surprised at who they influenced to perhaps change their mind on this issue. Somebody they had dinner with, or somebody that read an article that they wrote. So just develop your understanding of the issues, ask hard questions, and don't be afraid of the answers, and you can make a huge difference.
Thank you so much. Very beautiful answer, Denise. It's so interesting to hear about the work that you've done and how you really apply critical thinking and your understanding of freedom and how it really applies to our society. So on behalf of Cafe Chat and the team, we'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to being interviewed by us. And we definitely hope that you all enjoyed this wonderful chat. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
for coffee.